So this is the first week, first meaty content for my part of PO 2001. I have recorded the overall introduction video, and it's important that you watch that. That will appear here in Canvas. It's currently processing. And this will appear below it, which is the discussion of location and evaluation of sources, which is necessary before you can actually do any work on them. You have to find them. So this is the PowerPoint, and rather unusually, I'm happy with last year's PowerPoint, and I'm going to stick with it as soon as it loads up. And one of the fundamental problems is, how do we manage information and learn and find data for analysis in an information-rich age? How do we find and evaluate reliable sources? And this has become more and more of a problem and more of an issue as time goes on. So what is our destination? Why are we looking for stuff? And the answer is, we're looking for stuff to do qualitative research, and a great deal of qualitative research involves taking large chunks of text and coding it, marking up the parts of the text that carry meaning. So you may want to think about that and relate it back to the stuff Jason said about definitions and what terms mean and what words mean. Qualitative research is about that a lot. This is an old example of some coding. From interviews from British politicians in the 1960s about how they got into politics and what things influenced their decision to get into politics. So there's a transcript and there's some codes. It's a coding system that makes sense if you look at the full extent of it, and I'll show it to you later on. I don't want to spend too long on it now. I'm just flagging that this is the destination, right? And we can now do this much more effectively using digital tools. So there are tools available which will allow you to load the text in and have your codes set up, or create your codes as you go along and apply those codes to parts of the text. You can also do it with images. You can do it with video. Unfortunately, a lot of those tools are big, they're expensive, they're hard to learn, and they're really terrible at exporting data to other formats, which means you can put a lot of work into them and it can be very difficult to get it out. So we're not going to go as far as using those, but we are going to look at the principles that underlie that. Right? So that's the destination, that's the analysis part. Before we get there, we need to look at how we seek for information. How do we find information? And then we're going to start thinking about how we make sense out of it. We're not going to get to the resharing part of this workflow in terms of writing essays, blogs, whatever. We're going to focus on these two parts. So there's a set of general questions you can ask about evaluating sources when you search for them. How did you find it? What sort of source is it? Who's the author? What are their qualifications? There are many lists of these out there. This is just one that I threw together. It's not a definitive list. It's not your list. I'm not giving you a list, right? I want you to make up a list of criteria for the evaluation of sources. The reason I want you to do this is because the list that you make is one that you're likely to remember and use. Great many academics have been doing this for so many years that they find it difficult to explain the process, because we just do it instinctively. We look at an article and we can just click through the points in our mind, and we know whether it's relevant, useful, accurate, up to date, whatever, boom, and how it applies to the project that we're doing. Okay? And in fact, every library in the world does a set of pages and guidance on how to evaluate sources. So rather than giving you a list, what I want you to do is look at, you could look at some of the scholarly articles, but keep it simpler than that, actually. Look at what university libraries around the world have done in terms of the criteria and the guidance they give people for evaluation of sources. UCC has a set as well. I want you to find ones that will stick for you. You want 5 or 6 criteria. You may want some sub-criteria. This is Flinders University in Australia, and it takes a while for this one to load, but this is their guidance on evaluating sources. So they have a video. Video works better for some people, but I want a list. They have a PDF. They have some explanation on why you would use sources and the difference between scholarly and non-scholarly. So this is not a bad one. And then they have a list. So mostly they have major points with subpoints, right? Um, and that's how they've structured it, and it fits. It's quite long actually, and they have a note about Wikipedia which makes it a little bit longer. But if you actually boil it down to it, their list of criteria really is under this heading here, and it's pretty much, there you go. Uh, that's basically it. They have one, two, three. They actually have five major headings, 4 or 5 major headings, and they've clearly indicated where they've got them from, and they referred back to some other international standards, and that's nice. And that's pretty much about a list. Um, they've got a lot of subheadings. That might not work for everyone. It depends on how many subheadings you can learn, you know. This is from, I don't know where it's from, but you will come across this a lot, which is called the CRAP test. Which is a common set of headings: currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, purpose. Um, don't just copy and paste it, right? Um, think about whether it works for you. Think about the subheadings that you might want to use with it. Um, this one has a number of other options there. It has an evaluation sheet, it has a slide presentation, so it presents the information in different ways. Different university libraries will present this content in different ways. For example, although it's not showing up on the first page anymore of the search, I know that the page describing this in the Harvard University Library had no bullet points. I don't know, I guess Harvard don't do bullet points because they're too posh for bullet points. But that's a very valid point. You know, do you remember things as lists, or do you remember them as bits of text, or do you want to produce some kind of visual representation? But in any event, I want you to make up a set of criteria for evaluating sources. And I want you not just to list the criteria, but I want to give some range of possible values for them. So you want to have a scale. Could be A, B, C, D, could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, could be 1 to 10, could be good, bad, poor, indifferent, whatever works, whatever will stick in your mind. So you're going to find some sources, and for each of those sources, you're going to do this little table of the criteria and how they apply. Okay? Up to 10 sources is what you're going to go looking for. So then the question is, how do you find stuff? So there's a number of finding stuff. Let's get rid of some of these. Everybody, the research on university undergraduates and searching is conclusive, and there's a definite pattern across all the research for the past 10 years. And what most people do, and even university students, is they hit the first page of Google and they take results from the first page of Google. That's how people find sources on the web. The other big thing that people do is they start with Wikipedia. Okay, you need to think a little bit more than that. You need to look at Google Scholar, because you need to be using academic sources. And for a research topic that's contemporary, Google Scholar will not necessarily have good recent sources on something that's a current political controversy, because there's a lag in academic research, analysis, and publishing. So in terms of looking at sources for the current coronavirus crisis, the current pandemic crisis, Google Scholar will probably not yet have content. They will have content from the sciences, because there's a lot of science publication about virology going on, and they will have a great deal of that. As political scientists, you're not in any way qualified really to interpret that. So it's not much use for you. We're looking at the political aspects of it. But for example, and this is where you need to think about your search terms, Google Scholar will certainly have research, I would hope, on pandemic planning and response. Well, let's take the search that they offer. And they've got ethics. Now, this is interesting. I hadn't thought of including ethics. But pandemic influenza preparedness, an ethical framework to guide decision making. And that's actually interesting, because ethics in terms of political decision making and what's moral and just and right and how we make political decision making, that's interesting. What Google does, Google allows you to see a number of things. You want to capture the citation, Google allows you, click that one, and it gives you a variety of different citation formats for the article, which is useful. It also tells you how many articles have cited this article since it was published. in 2006, which is 14 years ago. So 234 articles have cited it. There's also 28 different versions on the web. If you look at the citations, click in the new tab. So this is the 234 articles that have referred back to that article in the past 14 years. It's the ones that Google's found. Okay? And if in fact you want to restrict that, then you can just click it to restrict it to 2020. These are the articles this year that have referred back to that article. 234 citations was a decent amount. It's a fairly influential article. It might be worth a look. And there's some, I don't know whether that's any much use. It seems quite vague. And it is from a medical journal, so National Institute of Health, who's probably more technical than we want as politics people. For a complicated reason, I understand what this means, and the Ubuntu framework and Ubuntu as an approach to things, could be interesting, right? So this gives you, so what you can do with this is you can find relevant articles, and then you can find what's being done downstream from this. Now, in fact, the library does something very similar. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it a little bit easier for myself. I'm going to take, here we go. I'm going to copy this title. Because on the front page of the library, there is this one search box, which searches everything the library has access to. So I'm just going to put that title in there. And if you're outside the library, that's okay. I'm not logged in, but it'll tell me eventually. There we go. There's the article. It's from British Medical Council Medical Ethics. It says the full text is available online. So if I click full text online, and it also lists other relevant articles, this will give me, it remembers, it logged me straight in. Accept those cookies. So there you have the full text of the article, which also allows you to see the references in the article. There aren't many, actually, which would allow you to go look back and see what previous work this was based on. And that will allow you to see the structure of the academic debate and how it's developed over time, right? Which is an important part of qualitative research. There's the references. And as you can see, again, increasingly, when journals or articles are presented online, where they have a bibliography, they also provide you with links if the article is available openly, or to Google Scholar if it's not, so that you can try and find it, which is excellent. So you want to get beyond the first page of Google, right? That was the first page of Google. You want to use sites like Google Scholar. You want to use the library's OneSearch. You will at some point want to bring down the full text of some of these, because later on, or at least you'll want to record the web references. Where can I find this on the web? Because you will want to use at least 3 of these later in what we're doing, okay? In a couple of weeks. So remember to capture the web address, and the proper citation. Whatever citation format you're happy with. I like Harvard. Some people in politics prefer Chicago. Political scientists tend to prefer the APA, which I don't like at all. But as long as you're consistent, that's what's important. Okay, so that's looking for stuff. But there are other things. So Google Scholar, looking for stuff. There are other things that you need to think about. Twitter is now a valid source. I know Twitter is large parts of it are a festering cesspit of abuse, misinformation, and fake news. But if you're selective about whom you follow, what journalists, for example, do you follow? Because professional journalists filter the sources, report factual news, and will quote and reference, a range of sources. So that's certainly something. Commentators in the field, there's a number of people who have established themselves as authoritative public commentators on parts of the current pandemic. Mostly people in various branches of epidemiology and public health. and also people on the front line of the medical profession, and some people in politics. For example, there's a dispute going on this weekend in the UK over increased lockdown in the north of England, and Andy Burnham, the Labour politician who's the mayor of Greater Manchester, has come out and taken a position on this, on the economics and the economic supports, and he's been very articulate about it. And he is either tweeting himself or news reports are tweeting his comments. So there's a source that can very quickly get you direct quotes, provided you can verify them. There are other accounts on Twitter. There'd be a whole range of accounts on the no lockdown hashtag or something like that, which would be spreading false information. And the art of verifying stuff on the internet is a big question. Who is this person? Again, a lot of the criteria apply. Who is running the account? How long has it been there? Do they have any expertise in the field? Things like this. I use a number of tools. I have a thing called Feedly on my iPad, which harvests updates from all sorts of websites and news sources that I follow. Google Scholar allows you, or at least it used to, yes, here on Google Scholar, on the sidebar, there's a button called Create Alert. So once you've refined a search and found a topic that you're interested in this case it's the references to this article, you can click the button to Create Alert, and it will, anytime this article is now cited, it will send an email to the account you choose, and you can choose how many reports, how many results you get. And also, I think you can choose how frequently. You used to be able to choose how frequently. Once you click that, it adds it to your Google Alerts. Boom. You get the email anytime Google finds something that matches that alert. So you can use tools like this to automate the process. You can set alerts for Twitter accounts every time Richard Chambers tweets. The people who are doing data visualization, like David Higgins, or Illustrate This, you can set alerts to get their tweets come up as alerts on your Twitter, and that will allow you to keep pace with what they're saying and what they're doing about the stuff. Official documents. Official documents are wordy. Many of them are open, or they're open after a point in time, but they are very often written to conceal rather than reveal. And they're the product of a consensus. So they show you what the outcome of a meeting was, but not necessarily what the process within the meeting was, or whether there were differences of opinion. So they're written in a particular sort of bureaucratic English, which can be difficult to penetrate, and particularly for things like the World Health Organization, where and any other United Nations body, they are the product of an argument about what exactly are the facts. Very often, particularly you see it in the UN Security Council, ambassadors will come in and they will say stuff in the Security Council and get it into the minutes, which are blatantly at odds with the reality on the ground. But it's a diplomatic forum, and you have the same problem in the WHO. Chinese government officials made statements in WHO meetings, and they were not just making them for medical reasons, although the WHO is more technically reputable than some other international bodies, but they were also making them in a political context. And the nature of diplomacy is that when somebody's ambassador says something, you have to politely accept it, even if you know or suspect it's not true. So this is a problem with official documents, and trying to interpret them and work out what they actually really mean. And of course, this goes to qualitative research and coding and reading the documents and trying to figure out what do they mean. Journal articles, I've already mentioned that you should be looking for academic journal articles, and you'll have to be coming at things slightly sideways, because very few political science journals will have published yet articles on the current crisis. This is one of the problems of research on contemporary prices and practical research in politics. If you get a job as a research assistant to a TD in Leinster House, you're going to have to do research on topics where there is no handy academic article summarizing the stuff. So you've got to find articles that lay out the context of the argument and give you an intellectual framework for the debate. And we're going to look at that when we get to literature reviews, within which you can then locate the current information and make sense of it and understand, maybe the history of people are talking about particular issues. What have they written in the past? What theoretical perspective have they taken? What is their worldview on this? Can we get some kind of background so we can evaluate what they're saying now? Theoretically, academic articles are subject to peer review, which is more or less successful depending on the journal. Theoretically, they are properly referenced and they're cited correctly. Theoretically, they provide you with a deeper analysis. Sometimes they're very technical. Sometimes they're not very clear. Sometimes academic journal articles are unclear because the people writing them haven't fully worked out what their conclusions are themselves. But they need to publish an article to tick a box on their research productivity outputs assessment, so they just get something out there. So, I mean, these are all issues. With the other thing about it is, of course, that if you're not in, historically a problem was that we have access to a lot of them within the library because the library has subscriptions. If you're not in an academic library, if you're doing political research independently and you're trying to access these from outside, you find it costs an enormous amount of money, 30 or 40 euro, just to access a copy of an article for 24 hours to read. Academic publishers are making a lot of money out of the free labor of academics who write, review, edit the journals, and the publishers make the money out of it. And that's a big source of controversy at the moment in the academic world. News media. For contemporary political research, you have got to use news media and you have got to understand the difference between quality newspapers and what can only be described as comics. The red tops, the tabloids. Do not under any circumstances make the mistake of assuming that they are producing accurate news reporting. They're not. They're trying to whip up scandal and sensation in order to excite people and sell more copies. And this is why the sales figures for quality broadsheet newspapers have plummeted. Bad quality news drives good, well-researched news out of the market. Even the best newspapers, the New York Times, Telegraph was always biased, but it's become worse now. The Guardian has had, again, serious flaws in some aspects of its reporting. So even the best quality news outlets now sometimes, in the interests of balance and giving both sides of the argument, will publish stuff which is not factually robust. And you've got to be careful about that. You want to make sure, are you looking at the work of an established columnist, or are you looking at something that's simply a recycled news story off of Reuters or the Associated Press, which is actually offering no real analysis? If you're reading about Lebanon, Robert Fisk has been writing about Lebanon for 30 years. He knows a lot of people there. He has a feel for what's happening on the ground. If you're researching Lebanon, Robert Fisk's columns are worth a read. Is one example. But you need to think about this if you're looking at Brexit. Obviously, we know in this country, Tony Connolly has followed it in great detail and has a very fine grasp of what's going on and therefore writes good material on it. So it's a question of working out who the experts are. Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a good place to start, but a bad place to end up. Some academics will say never use Wikipedia. I would say use it, but you should trust but verify. Facts that are given in Wikipedia are the commonly accepted consensus that it is shaped by argument, including between the people who edit the pages. You're not allowed to put in original research into Wikipedia until it's been through the mill of academic peer review, in theory. Articles on controversial topics will not be trustworthy because they are edited several times a day. So articles on topics in contemporary politics will not be reliable. They will give you some flavour of the argument, but you really cannot depend on them to be factually accurate. So you have to track back to the sources, and theoretically every statement in Wikipedia is supposed to be referenced to a published source. But again, how good are those published sources that those things are based on? Read the talk pages, see what people are arguing about, look at the edit history, and see how frequently the page is edited and what people are putting in and taking out, to give you some idea of what's being done. And also look at the references. It's really useful if you go down to the bottom of a Wikipedia article. The footnotes and the external sources may give you some guide as to where you can go to find information. So it is trust, but verify. Everything verified. You should never have a footnote to Wikipedia because you should have tracked it back to the original source and determined if that source is valid and trustworthy, not Wikipedia itself. Newspapers, again, that was an example about climate change. It's a very bad article. It doesn't say who the author is. It links back to some news stories, which it appears merely to summarize. Articles that are simply summaries of other things are not, do not provide the depth that you want. This is a particularly worrying trend. Something that was noticed, and it's something that's come out of the 2016 election in the US. A large number of apparently local newspaper websites appeared in the Midwest, mainly, and they published local news, births, marriages, deaths, how the football team was getting on, where the road repairs were going to be and how that was going to affect traffic, stuff like that. And they established a reputation for reliability because they were producing reliable local news. And then, coming up to the 2016 election in the United States, they started sliding into that right-wing political op-eds. So having built a readership, they then set out to subtly influence them. Well, it turns out research that emerged in 2019 shows that actually several hundred of these small town American newspapers were actually being run by the Russians out of a bunch of server farms somewhere in, Russia. And they were harvesting the local news sources and building something that would have credibility, and then at the right moment subtly using it to influence people in the run-up to the 2016 election. So the methods of producing fake news now and fake information and misinformation have become much more subtle. And of course, you could argue that to a certain extent, all political statements and all political speeches have a certain measure of dishonesty in them as far back as you go in political history, but it's become much worse. And the need to analyze the manipulation has become much more serious. The other thing that's come up now as an issue is deep fake video. You should click through this slide and watch this video. And this is a couple of years old. The technology is now better. This is a video of Barack Obama, and they've used deep fake technology and mapping to a script to make the movements of his mouth look like he is actually saying what they've written into the script, which is not any public statement he ever made. Look at the sophistication of this, right? Look at how good it is as a fake and how credible it is, and realize that it is a few years old and that technology is now much better. So essentially, you can produce a video now of any political figure saying pretty much anything you want. And, exposing it as a fake is very difficult. It's technically demanding. So the basic principles remain the same. And you need a set of basic principles and a set of criteria for yourself that will allow you to evaluate sources on some kind of scale. And in doing this exercise, as I said, find up to 7 to 10 sources. Do include some Twitter, do include some video, because your criteria need to be robust enough to deal with those. Also pick a couple that are bad so that you can demonstrate that the criteria you've made up will allow you to detect sources that are not good. So don't just pick good sources, don't just pick academic, don't just pick newspaper, pick a range and pick a few that are explicitly bad, which should score poorly on your criteria when you apply them to it. And this is important. Again, it goes back to the research libraries and how I showed you those pages from libraries that teach people how to evaluate material for academic writing. Those pages are always lagging behind. None of them will have any explanation of how to apply your criteria to deepfake video or fake news on Twitter. Very few of them have actually got around to writing up some words to give you guidance on how to use your criteria for evaluation to Twitter accounts. And no doubt hey, TikTok, TikTok. How do we evaluate TikTok? But TikTok is now increasingly an important medium of political commentary. So, and it's got a specific format for expressing things. And how do you wade through that and work out what the political message is and make a judgment on how good it is? If somebody can come up with a set of criteria that will credibly apply to TikTok, we'll all be interested in seeing this. So you do that exercise. Your list of, there's the discussion. I will update that from last year's date to this year's date. You will share in that discussion 7 to 10 sources with your criteria and their scores, and maybe a short, less than one line explanation of why you gave them a particular score. Do not go into great lengths about this. Okay, keep it simple. It's a checklisty thing. And you'll probably never do it in as much detail again, because if it works for you this time, you will remember by virtue of doing it actively. Enough of it will stick in your mind that in future, when you're looking at sources, you will actually apply it, which is why we're doing this as an active learning and a collaborative and open exercise, rather than just me handing you a list of criteria and saying, here, go and do that, because you would just clip those into a ring binder and throw it in the corner and never look at it again, because that's the way what happens when you give this as a handout. And it's more important that you actually absorb this. Even if it's not perfect, what's perfect here, there's no right answer. The right answer is a set of criteria that work for you. Okay? That's what's the right answer, because this is your journey through the process that we're trying to improve. Okay? So I will have a look at that. I may respond to some of them directly in the discussion forum, but what will happen then is that I will gather some thoughts on the common points of those, and the video that links to the next topic will build from this to that. So that's how we will proceed over the next 4 weeks.